members of our ward had died, my father always gave me certain assignments to help with the preparation of before the funeral. I probably wasn't invited, but I was given the responsibility by my father to assist the undertakers who carried the bodies in their specially built wagons called hearse, drawn by usually 2 head of horses. And I was given the responsibility to take care of those horses during the time of the funeral. And one of the chores was to give them a little snack of oats in an oat bag, and the other was to give them a drink of water, which I did. And I usually took them up to the spring that was partway up in the field. And then I'd have them ready for the undertaker when the service was concluded. My father had the same experiences as most of the pioneering folks in this town and elsewhere, inasmuch as he always had financial problems and could hardly make his way. He was in debt, buying his home, buying his farm, and buying a home, and trying to rear a family. To augment the income that came from the farm, and sometimes the income was very, very little. Sometimes we had a freeze out and it didn't amount to very much. He used to do work on the roads. He graded the roads. He was the road man in Pleasant View, representing Weber County for many, many years. And we had an old scraper that we used to use to kind of grade the roads. It had 2 blades. It was made of steel. It was controlled by a lever to give it pitch. And we used to run this thing up and down the roads in order to make them a little more smooth. They were all dirt roads in those days. One of the things he did, and he was very well known for, was that in the wintertime he would spend most of the winters digging wells for people. Wells that were built in casements where they could tunnel in and bring out the water for culinary purposes. He dug more than 100 wells during many years, digging several a year each winter, in Pleasant View, North Ogden, at the industrial school, up on the bench sites, several bench sites in Ogden and elsewhere. These wells were usually constructed with the help of 2 metal forms. One was larger than the other. They were both round and they were put together with bolts. The first thing you would do in digging a well was to dig make a 6-foot circle and dig down several feet within the circle. And of course, he had to locate what he thought was the water source to begin with, and that was one of his responsibilities, which he did with a forked stick, and claimed that it was quite reliable. And then when he'd dig down and get down 5 or 6 feet, he would put these forms down in that hole. The smaller one would be on the inside, and the larger one would be on the outside next to the bank. And he'd pour this form full of cement, sometimes putting reinforcement in it. And then after the cement had cured a day or two, he'd pull the forms off, and he'd continue his digging down for another 4 or 5 or 6 feet. As soon as he had done this, he would build the form, put the forms on top of the cement that had already started to cure, and he'd pour another batch of cement. And this would serve as additional weight to push the first section down in the well. He, of course, would have in the meantime dug down so that it could slide down in the hole he had dug. Sometimes he'd have to use crowbars or pipes to release the suction on the outside, but the forms would always seem to go down. Then he'd dig 5 or 6 more feet and let the forms down and build on top of them, so that one form was pushing the others. The newly formed forms would, full of cement, would push the other forms down. And that way he protected himself as he dug the wells. And when he'd get down to where he needed help to get the dirt out, he'd build a trapezoid over the well, use a cable and pulley, and then use the famous old horse that was so famous in our family, so reliable, Old Dick. And Old Dick was trained so well at digging wells that after a while, after he'd been doing this for a while, we never used a rider. We just put a log out to the distance he was supposed to go when he pulled the buckets up. And he'd go up that far and stop. And then when we'd swing the bucket of mud out at the top of the well, he'd back up so that the buckets could settle down, and we'd dump the mud and the water out. And this way he went down to where the water was, and when he got enough water, and this was in the winter time, in the fall, when the water supply in the ground was always the least. So that if he found water, we could always be pretty sure that there'd be more water later in the year and in the spring and the summer when it was needed. And when the water would get so much that he couldn't bail the water out fast enough and get the mud with it, then he'd have to abandon the well and figure that he'd captured as much water as he probably could. Then he'd go below the well, and these were usually always on the hillside, these particular ones I'm talking about. And he'd tunnel back in as deep as he could. The first part of the tunnel was, or the first part of the trench, I should say, not tunnel. He'd trench back in. And the first part was quite wide, probably 6 feet wide, and of course you can imagine by hand it would take a lot of work. And this 6-foot trench would go down probably 6 feet or more. And then he'd go on the inside of that and dig a narrower trench and go on down, and he'd throw the mud and the dirt up to this wider part, and then somebody would shovel it from there on up and out. And then that way he could go a lot deeper than if he tried to do it from all one narrow trench. And as soon as he'd gotten as deep as he could go, he'd break the casing, the well, on the outside, and make a hole, go inside, angle the pipe downward into the water, and make his connections and extend his pipe on down to the house, or those places where they were going to use it. And when the water raised, or if it didn't, they would start a siphon. If the water raised above the exit of the pipe, the siphon would automatically take over. Otherwise, they'd have to start the siphon. And then they'd siphon the water out at this lower level. This is a very laborious job. It took a lot of work and sweat and time. And there were several times when he didn't get paid for doing any of this because the people said you didn't get the water we expected you'd get. So in some cases he was mistreated, even though he did lots and lots of hard work. And many has been the time that I went down and helped him in this well, in the wells. And the ones which furnish us water today, I helped dig. In fact, he'd always tell his boys, well, I'll dig you one for you. And the one that I'm using at the present time is the one that he and I dug together. And the one that he dug for me originally is going to Leon Jones across the street now. Another well that was used is being used by Paul. It was dug up further up in the field, and it was dug with the idea that he could have interest in that. On our property behind our house, just northward, were wells that were dug for the church, for the school, for the neighbors across the road. And we had good sources of water in our field that provided several wells for other people, the Baileys, Farmer Johns, and others. And so this was one thing that my father did in order to get money to keep his family going, digging wells. And he was known by everyone, and still known by some of the older people today, as the one that pioneered in getting lots of water for people for their culinary purposes. And of course his father was a pioneer in reclaiming water. And he, together with his father, Simeon Cragun, Wilford, my father's father, and Simeon, his grandfather, my great-grandfather, as I mentioned on one of the tapes before, were the ones that reclaimed much of the mountain water that is now used for culinary purposes in North Ogden and Pleasant View. And I mentioned also that my grandfather was buried alive in a drain, didn't lose his life. And that's a story that's found elsewhere. I'd like to mention that in doing work in reclaiming ground and wells and other things, that our fields were covered with, the upper fields were covered with big rocks, big boulders. And these boulders were enormous. And some were embedded in the ground. And most of my younger years, in the early teens and later teens, much of my Christmas holidays were spent helping to reclaim land. My father used to say, during the Christmas holidays, we can reclaim a half acre of ground. And the people that are living in the homes and gardening in this area today, and of course this has been subdivided, all this land is covered with homes today, they can never appreciate nor realize the efforts that went forth in days gone by to reclaim this land. My father used to take us boys, I remember particularly when I was with him alone, and he'd take us up and we'd dig underneath these rocks, and he'd place dynamite down in those holes. And he'd take the caps and prepare them and put them in the dynamite, put a fuse on them, and when we would get half a dozen of these done, he'd say, okay, now you bend the fuse over so that it faces towards the ground, and it'll light a lot quicker. And he'd give me about 2, and he'd take 4 or 5 to light. And if mine wouldn't light just as quickly as I thought they should, I'd get panicky as can be. And he'd sometimes get all of his lit, and the fuses would be burning, and I'd still have mine or one of them to go, and he'd do that for me. And then we'd scamper and run over behind a big rock quite a ways away and count the blasts that went off. And I will remember that he used to say, there's one that didn't go, and we'll not get near it. We won't inspect anything until tomorrow. We'll give it a chance to see if it's going to sizzle and go off later. And if there's one that didn't go, then he was mighty careful to wait, and then careful how he explored the situation afterwards. Because he used to tell the stories of when he was the blasting man on the American Falls Dam in Idaho. He and another man did the blasting for that dam. And again, that was one thing that he did in the wintertime when he was living in Idaho in order to gain extra money for the family. And on this dam, he said that this other fellow used to take and pinch the caps onto the fuses, and he became quite brazen to where he put them in his mouth and pinched the caps with his teeth. And he saw this man get his head blown off. And of course that was a dreadful and a horrible experience. And it made him more cautious than ever. And when he pinched the cap onto the fuse, he'd do it with his pocket knife and be very careful that he didn't get too close up to the powder, because the cap is the most dangerous part of the blasting operation. The dynamite takes a horrible jar. The cap can have the jar or a jar, or it can be ignited by a flame or a spark, and it is much more deadly, more dangerous to handle than the dynamite, because the dynamite has to take a big jar in order to get it to go off. And so we reclaimed a half-acre, more or less, of ground each Christmas holidays, and that's where we spent our time. Sometimes it was muddy and snowy, stormy, but we seemed to get quite a bit done. After we'd blasted the rocks, broken them up, we'd take 3 head of horses with a chain, hook onto these rocks, pull them over to the hollow, and when they'd get to the hollow, we'd drive the horses down into the hollow and then whip them to get them going. And they'd go down the hollow and up the other side, and the rock would roll down and behind them, and as it rolled, the chain would always come off. And they'd come out the other side, and we'd go over and get them. And then we'd bring them around and repeat the operation. We had what we called a big road plow. It was a hard thing for 1 or 2 men to handle. 3 head of horses. But it was strongly made, very awkward, very heavy. And it was the means by which we were able to get some of the rocks out. I remember this old horse, Dick, I've mentioned once before, probably the most famous horse that we ever had. He was on the job one day when we were blasting, and he was a very gentle horse, but still he was excitable. And my baby brother Weldon, who was a little fellow then, he was sitting on the back of the horse, leisurely, quite a ways from where the blasting was to take place. We were over there with him, but he was still sitting on the horse. And I well remember that when the first blast went off, that horse jumped so quickly that Weldon lit right where his back feet were standing. He just absolutely disappeared from under Weldon. So this was one operation that we were involved in, digging wells, reclaiming water, putting in drains. Sometimes we had drains where we just tunneled in, took flat rocks, put them on either side of the drain and a flat rock over top, and made our own pipe because there were no cement pipe in those days. And in this way piped the water out so we could use it for irrigation purposes. We had 3 ponds, the lower pond, the middle pond, and the upper pond. We had these ponds so we could turn the water in, reclaim the spring water so that it could be gathered into the ponds, and we could let it out so we could have a sizable stream in order to properly do our irrigation. Sometimes we'd take the mountain streams when our turn came and fill the pond at night, and then we could see better how to handle it in the daytime, store the water at night. There's in one of these ponds where I was baptized, in Chancey Reese's, in Herbert Reese's pond up in his field. And I was baptized by Herbert Reese. He used to do all the baptizing for years. And it was up in his particular pond where he did most of this. So there were many irrigation ponds, or reservoirs, homemade reservoirs in those days. We didn't have the pipe. We didn't have the gates. So we had to make our own pipe with rocks, and we had to make our own gates. The way we did that was to take an unused, discarded hub of a wagon, and we'd put it down in the bottom of the pond on the deep end, the lower end, and then we'd take the axle that goes into the hub and put it in there, insert it in as the plug. And when we let the water out of the pond, it would go through the axle, through the hub, and then when we wanted to block it off, we'd drop the axle down in it. That was a very crude and homemade way of doing things, but that's the way we did it. And in order to get out over to where this was, we'd have a platform similar to a diving board that with a walkway that went out over this plug so that we could manually pull this plug out and hook it onto this diving board type of thing, platform. And we could gauge how much water was going out, or we could use this as a means by which we could hold the plug entirely out of the water. So these were some of the interesting things that we used to do, struggling to make a living. Digging wells, reclaiming land, and doing all sorts of things that were necessary to improve the situation that could likewise help further the farming efforts on our farm and in our Pleasant View town. Speaking of finding extra work to do, as boys we used to do this same thing. We were hopeful of getting a little bit of work on the side so that we could make some money. And the wages in those days was probably $1.50 a day. I think during my life, up to the time I was married, and actually after that time, I worked for never more than $3 a day. And that was for a day's work. That wasn't for 8 hours. That was for as long as the man that was hiring you wanted to work you. In August the 23rd, 1923, we had a series of floods along the Wasatch Front. One that was very serious was in Farmington, Utah. And the one that we know so very well here was in Willard. The cloudbursts that happened up into the mountains came down the canyon, washed away homes. I think some folks lost their lives. It buried the highway under many feet of dirt, silt, and rocks. It covered some homes up to the windows with mud, and some were damaged very severely. It took a long time to come out of that, and for the people to get dug out from the devastating effects of that horrible flood. R.T. Reese had some honeybees east of the town of Woolard, and I remember going out there with him to help reclaim just a little fellow, because we were all concerned about his bees, and he lost nearly all of them. The hives were mashed, broken, mud was inside, and they had a hard time reclaiming those bees. That is, anything from them. Very little was reclaimed. I remember riding a horse up there with somebody else, and I remember how soft the mud was right after the flood the next day. What a terrible situation it really was. The people reclaimed the town, and today you wouldn't know that that tragedy ever struck that area. Although there's many rocks, and it's much more gravelly, and the terrain has been changed, and some of the effects are noted on some of the homes that they saved, wherein there's almost steps to get down into the home instead of going in on the level. We had some of the effects of that flood in our town. On what is called now 1100 West, then called Farron's Lane, there was a deep wash there. And my father was road commissioner, and he hired Samuel Farron to get with his team a grader and grade those big holes back in. And I was given the job to help him to operate the wheels that controlled the blade under the grader while Samuel drove the horses. The largest wash was on 1100 West, just north of 3800 North. And there was quite a hillside to the northwest where Andrew Rose used to have a home. And the idea was just to pull a lot of that dirt down into this wash to fill it up. And we graded there, and it took us several weeks. I'm not sure how many, but 2 or 3 weeks to do very much there, because it was done not like we do things today. A bulldozer could have, in just a matter of a few hours, done what we did in several weeks. We couldn't get the grader over far enough to push much of the dirt in, and so Joseph Rollins was hired to take his team, and he'd put a chain across the wash and get on the other side, and he'd pull the grader over in to help pull the dirt in with it. And there I was operating the controls, and Samuel's on the front end of the grader. One time he pulled us a little too far, and the grader started tipping over, and Samuel Farron jumped off. And he always said after that he'd hurt himself in such a way that he felt it the rest of his life. But this is just another incident of trying to earn a little money to help the causes in those days where there was very few funds. After the junior high students had attended the junior high school in North Ogden for some time, new friendships really grew, and the individual town loyalties greatly subsided. I well remember that before Christmas time, Ing and Fred Larson and myself decided to go together and cut some Christmas trees. I furnished the horse and a small one-horse Ludlow, We went up into the Coldwater Canyon east of North Ogden. There were no restrictions in getting trees in those days. We found and cut our trees and started down the mountainside. And as we did so, the horse, we could see, couldn't handle the wagon and hold it back. And we really staged a real Western rated runway. We all jumped for our lives, and the horse and wagon went at top speed, racing down the hill till the front wheel struck a large tree and the horse tore loose and disappeared. This was a real tragic experience for all of us. How would I get home? What would my dad say? Where was the horse? How could we recover the wagon? What about the trees? And all those things entered my mind. And I'll tell you, it was a long